Thank you all for joining us for live Q&A and office hours with Dr. Chris Wheat, co-president for the JPMorgan Chase Institute. This session is a follow-up to Dr. Wheat's video lecture that you've already watched. Once again, Chris Wheat, Ph.D., is co-president for the JPMorgan Chase Institute. Prior to joining JPMCI, he served as the director of analytics at a financial technology startup where he led the development of advanced analytics algorithms. He also previously was an assistant professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management, at the Center for Urban Entrepreneurship and Economic Development at Rutgers Business School. And as a faculty member, he taught and researched topics in strategy, entrepreneurship, global microfinance, economic sociology, and social network analysis. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. We have a few people lined up to ask questions, but I'm going to start us off. So for those who are not familiar with the JPMorgan Chase Institute, can you talk a little bit about what it is, what it does, and how you found your way there?
The first two are easier for sure. Okay, so the JPMorgan Chase Institute, so we've been around for, publicly anyway, just for over 6 years, and our mission is to try to help policymakers, mostly economic policymakers, understand with data, anonymized data from JPMorgan Chase, the whole platform. So a lot of that is retail customer data, but not all of it is. Just shed the light that we can on the global economy, mostly the US economy, so that they can make more informed decisions about policy. So we're in the business of informing economic policy. We are a team of data scientists, sort of ranging from people just out of college through people many years past their PhD, trying to thread together, clean, process, analyze the lens that we have through JPMorgan Chase's business on the economy to help people make those decisions. And so that's long story short what we do. We produce reports, data series sometimes, short form, long form insights. We do webinars, we engage directly with policymakers and their staff, whatever we can to try to help them do their job.
So I mentioned when I read your bio that you have a background in Fintech. So we have a range of individuals participating in this institute, from PhD students in the social sciences to faculty members and everything in between, from all sorts of disciplines. So can you tell us a little bit about what Fintech is, how you got involved, and I'd love to also know areas of untapped research within Fintech. We have people here looking for research projects right now. So tell us a little bit about your experience with that.
No, that's a great question. And partly you had asked before, and I didn't answer, like, how did I end up here after a couple of stops along the way, which is related a bit to sort of at least like how I found myself in Fintech. So what is Fintech? I would say it's, man, it is really a catch-all term sometimes, but it's mostly people who are in the financial services sector, delivering some sort of financial services product, using usually at least biggish data, right? And so, you know, when I was in the role that I was in before I came here, that was basically an academic spinoff. So prior to doing that work, I had spent a few years in academia, I went more than a few years, probably about 10 years, teaching business school, strategy, entrepreneurship, and doing economic sociology research in short, and found myself applying that background plus the background that I had in computer science before that to trying to build some products and services for many customers, of whom financial services was one. And so we framed that as Fintech in the sense, which it can be a little bit of a catch-all. But everything from you know, products that help you households and individuals make better decisions, to, you know, aggregators of financial information, to credit provisioning. There's a variety of things that kind of land in that Fintech space, where it's really anything financial services, usually a little bit more innovative than the traditional finance sector, although lots of even what we would do now, you know, a large bank or otherwise would have been what we would call Fintech, you know, a year or two ago. You asked about untapped research. That is such an unbounded question. Like, I mean, there's so, I mean, a lot of the questions, or one bucket of questions, at least that I think is interesting, is there are a lot of people who are not that well attached to the financial services sector in terms of the product and service offerings as they traditionally exist. So there's a bunch of interesting innovative work or innovative interest in delivering to that kind of the unbanked, underbanked, like everything that kind of lives in that world in the US and abroad. And then the research questions often are like, how might you do that? What would happen if you did it one way versus another? Size what the opportunity is, understand why the gaps are what they are. All of that I think is there's just huge scope to do research in that space that certainly we see.
Our first participant question is from Rashun. Go ahead and turn your camera on.
Hi, Dr. Wheat. Thank you for joining us today. Just a question around, I guess, around cryptocurrency and the financial and the adoption of cryptocurrency. And I've been interested in, I guess, like investment and especially Black people investment and hesitancy of investing in cryptocurrency. And I was just wondering if, just watching part of the video and looking at the work that you do at the Institute, just wondering if there has been any like algorithms or looking at particular populations and their interest in cryptocurrency. I know that, well, I've read about JPMorgan Chase creating like their own cryptocurrency. So just wondering about that.
That is a great question, to which unfortunately I'm not gonna have a great answer. Like I'm not an expert in crypto. I know probably just enough about it to be dangerous, and so I'll be careful what I say here. Yes, it is true that the firm has been interested in understanding the market, what it means for the firm. I would say probably a little bit more broadly, sort of what it means for the financial services sector as a whole, and probably even, well, whether or not the firm is interested, I would say there continues to be just an interest in sort of like what does it mean for governments and the economy, and sort of that the relationship between particularly the large like big finance and government, right? Like a lot of what is interesting and innovative about crypto is the way that it rearranges who has the rights to sort of move currencies around in certain ways, right? So I think that's why there's a lot of interest from JPMorgan and others. The one adjacent thing that I would maybe offer in response to your question, and again, like it's only going to probably be so helpful. In some of the research that we've done on understanding household financial outcomes as they differ by race, I'm trying not to get too far risky here, but like one of the interesting observations, this isn't really on our data, this is what you would see from, like, for instance, the Fed survey of consumer finance, is the relatively differential participation of, call it white families, Black families, Latinx families, across just investment classes to begin with, where even like at a sort of much more basic level in terms of which assets are households invested in and how that differs by race in terms of basic things like just like, do you have a mortgage? Do you own a home? To the extent that you got past that layer or sort of have that layer in your asset portfolio, do you have stocks and bonds? Do they really get past 401ks into sort of individual like IRA type investments? Like you narrow the funnel among Black families so much just through those kind of basic steps that while I don't know what the relative participation rates are in crypto across race, it wouldn't be surprising if they follow that basic pattern. And some of that is just about sort of like, do you have enough incremental investable assets to get into something like a cryptocurrency that has a relatively high, it's not as well understood, I'm trying not to make any news here, it's not as understood of an asset class. And so like, if you don't have as much capital to put into something that's a little bit more speculative like that, it's not so surprising to see the gaps, I think.
So I'm going to jump in again. Can you talk us through some of the projects you've worked on since you joined JPMorgan Chase? Some interesting research projects and sort of policy, white papers and policy advisements that have sort of come out of your shop. So I guess I'm looking for you to brag a little bit about the work that's happening over there.
Sure. Look, so for most of the time that I was in the Institute anyway, I led our small business and local economic development work. We called it local commerce work at the time, and we're in the middle of a rebranding project, perhaps. And like one, maybe two interesting things from that. One, we did a lot of what I guess I would call foundational, even descriptive work, right? Like the sort of thing I didn't really have the shape of the kind of academic research I was doing when I was in the academy proper. Just trying to characterize the financial lives of small businesses, and particularly the very small business. So, a lot of people, particularly over the last year, have they become more aware of small business finance, might think about small businesses as maybe 200 employees or less, or 500 employees or less, depending on what the conversation is. In our data and in the world, we mostly see, quite small businesses that are 5 employees or less, let's say. And among, that part of the sector that comprises where, most of the businesses themselves are, where the business owners are, we did a lot of work just characterizing like how thin the liquidity, the amount of cash on hand these businesses typically had, to help people understand that like most of those businesses are typically working on a couple of weeks of cash. And that was like, interesting for what it was 5 years ago, but it became super important over the last year. It's a little bit complicated because of all the programs and all the federal policy. But as COVID showed up and really changed the demand characteristics, like a lot of people stopped going to businesses to buy things at all, and certainly sort of small and local businesses, we saw pretty market drops in their revenues, and knowing what we knew about their cash liquidity situation, that led to a lot of really interesting conversation with policymakers about like what the right kind of support structures would be, what we might anticipate going forward, how different parts of the economy might diverge through the recovery in terms of the relatively faster or slower parts that might be where you might see relatively fast recovery and other parts of the economy relatively slower recovery among small businesses. Is this a thing that local policymakers, city leaders in particular, have been very interested in? The only thing I would just highlight, one of the cool things about the data that we have on the in another data set where we're looking at debit and credit cards, is there a really unique perspective on sort of like how people move around from their home to the places that they consume things. So we're not the only kind of data that you could use to understand that, but particularly in the economic sense of like, how do you understand the landscape of, you might like generalize what is sometimes called as the food desert problem to in general, like what is the structure of people's consumption across space and time, and what disadvantages or differences do we see across communities in terms of that? Those have been some of the things that I think have gotten the most traction amongst policymakers.
So our next question is from Maxine, and then after that, Yandu. So Maxine, go ahead and turn your camera on.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Wheat, for being here. So my question is, if you can talk a little bit more about how you engage with policymakers, and you had just started talking about what kind of data that they're interested, but if you could speak a little bit more about what questions they want answered, what kind of data you use, and what kinds of policy decisions that you've seen come out of that.
No, thanks, Maxine. That's a great question, and it's something I think we continue to like evolve our thinking about. I would say early days we really focused, I think, across the Institute on basically, and this is probably familiar to all researchers, like I have some data, so what questions can I answer with this data? And can I find people who are interested in the answers that I have? Or like, can I find the questions for the answers that we have? In some sense, like that was fine because they're the broad swath of things that you might be able to tell people about short-term financial fluctuations, volatility, both in the household sector, in small businesses, and quite frankly, in financial markets. We just had access to data that a lot of people kind of had a sense of, like, that there was phenomenologically something there that was policy relevant, but they didn't necessarily come with questions. And we evolved the policy conversation in some cases with the policymakers, where it's like, well, here's what we're saying. Like, well, if you're saying that, well, then maybe we should be thinking differently about, how do you construct savings mechanisms and incentives? How might you sort of deploy federal safety net programs in light of the what we're now starting to understand in terms of how households have financial volatility in a way we just really hadn't seen before. So some of that evolved along the way. I would say more recently, we've been much more, well, we have the benefit of having developed those relationships over at least a few years, so that now, if somebody has a question, maybe they'll call us and be like, hey, we know you have this kind of data, we have this kind of question, can you answer this or not? And my inbox certainly every week has some version of a question. Do you know anything about, social safety net programs, a little bit more on the household side, how small businesses are doing, what's happening in terms of like this particular local economy, where we get a lot of inbound questions, and we can do a little bit better matching prospectively to make sure that the research that we're doing is actually answering the question that somebody's ready to action on. So I think it's a really good question.
So I'm going to ask a quick follow-up question. So we're learning about building partnerships and collaborating with business, industry, government. We had a great presentation by someone from the California Policy Lab about how they negotiate with government out there. So what's the bar for your institute making decisions to partner with academics and researchers? And under what situations do you make data available? So after that question, you'll hear from Yandu, and I'm warning you, we've got a follow-up cryptocurrency question from Rashad too. So take it away.
Oh, how can I answer this question effectively and supportively? So we have experimented with a couple of different models for working with academics. The upshot of which has been they are really valuable partnerships to us, and they are very expensive is a word that is in the front of my head. They're expensive in the sense that both in getting to learn the systems, the data, but also in some sense just kind of like the organization and the organization and its culture. You can sort of see my work sociology roots here showing. It tends to be a very long-term investment of years to really make the partnership work in both directions, right? We need to bring we need to do a lot of sharing out with our academic partners so they kind of understand how to work with us, and how to work with private sector data where it's easy to use it improperly, sort of to maybe gloss over that a little bit. So the relationships that we currently have are, for the most part, quite old relationships that we started some while ago. We've been cautious about building new ones because we know it both takes a long time to build a relationship, and then also the life cycle of an academic project is also in the scope of years typically, and so we want to be very careful to make sure that when we make a new investment, which we haven't done in a while of the sort, that it's going to be a good 5-year investment at least, or something like that. So that's kind of one way of answering the bar question, though they have been incredibly productive partnerships. That's particularly the case where somebody has direct access to the data. I think we have done a bit more in the last few years trying to find ways to partner where we are offering something of value to the academic researcher, and they are offering something of value to us without us having to build that heavyweight relationship that we need to contain, access to the microdata. So we have products that we work on with people where our team does the actual data access, but we'll have meetings with an academic about what we're seeing. They might make a suggestion about a follow-up analysis to do as we go back and forth like that. I think that is probably the bulk of the path forward in terms of most academic relationships we do on a go-forward basis. though we might do some of those more heavyweight ones too. We just haven't quite found the right way to do it yet.
I suspect after this, you may get 24 emails from
yeah,
our
every time I have this conversation, I'm open to the emails. I just want to level set so that people aren't like what you said, and then I feel bad about it.
Thank you, Chris. Yandu, go ahead. Next question.
Hi, thanks again for talking with us today. So my question you've kind of alluded to, but I hope it doesn't overlap too much with what you've already said. So I'm still very interested in research, but I want to explore it in a non-academic environment. So from your experience, what do you like and not particularly like about doing research because you've done it like in the academic setting and now in this non-academic setting? What has your experience been? What do you like, not like about either one?
Yeah, all the questions are great questions. This is also a good question. And they are different. I think probably the biggest dimension of difference is the time cycle. Like we are, like my organization, we're in kind of a weird, uncommon middle place where our projects, range from, let's call it like 3 to 9 months. Like I'm sure that's not exactly accurate. But a short project for us would be a couple of months, and we have tried to limit the number of longer projects we do than that. And that comes with pros and cons, right? Like there are some questions that takes longer than that to really figure out what you're doing. And for the most part, unless we can find a way to break it up into smaller pieces, like we just don't do those. That is a good question. They don't do it. And then when I see people applying sort of the research toolkit in the private sector that aren't like a research organization per se, which there just aren't that many like research organizations that sit in the private sector. Like those projects go much, much faster, right? Like it's like, I need an answer to this in, a couple of weeks or something like that. And so that to me is probably the dominant sort of dimension of difference. And paired with that is like seeing the impact of your work, or maybe that's just what's downstream of that. Like one of the things that's nice about the shorter term projects is first that they end more quickly, which can be a reward in and of itself sometimes. But you are closer to the outcome. It's much more, clear sort of what happens, after you've done the research and sort of like whether or not it made an impact. So I personally, I value that. But it tends to be more narrow, right? It's like you're working on a very narrow project, you don't work on it that long, the answer might be like reasonably good, but not like all that good. And so that's some of the trade-off. And I think there's a lot of, we couldn't do what we do if there weren't other people doing the longer form stuff, right? Like we need that as part of the value chain. So those are the biggest difference.
I'm going to hand it back to Rashan for a cryptocurrency question.
Hey, Rashan.
Hey, Dr. Lee. It's I guess it's like crypto related, and it's kind of like also, it's not too often someone from a huge organization or banking system that get to ask questions. So, I was doing an internship in Brazil. I overstayed, and I got a bill. I got a fine, and I had to send the money to Banco do Brasil, and I was trying to do it through my bank, and with like the SWIFT, so like there's a lot of digits with SWIFT, and it had to go to like the federal police, so that's where the money, like, and sure, I was just really asking about like the research around like cross-border payments. And is there anything on the horizon, or like thinking about the horizon on how to make the SWIFT like payments faster, better, more efficient, and how to make that more efficient, especially.
I think again, like I know a little bit about a bunch of things, and this is going to be another one of these categories. I believe it is the case, but I could be wrong here. So first, I should answer it because I'm asking. A, I don't know. B, like we haven't. That's not. well, we haven't taken on that question or sort of like that family of questions as part of our research scope. I think it's nevertheless the case that like one of the Fed research groups like publishes research on like those payment systems, SWIFT in particular, as they've tried to think about how it might evolve going forward. But like that is just like a vague recollection, because like I try to stay informed about like everything that's happening in sort of the world of financial services, and particularly around the Federal Reserve. So I don't know the answer to the question. I am under the impression that there's a reasonably robust dialogue around like what is the evolution of payment systems going to look like, you know, particularly in the domain of cross-border or sort of bank-to-bank. But I don't have a whole lot of depth there, only enough to sort of point in that direction.
I'm going to jump in with another question. Since I don't think it's okay for me to ask you for stock tips right now, I will choose a different direction. So let's go back to your work in analytics and also your work creating algorithms. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you got involved with that work, what you created, and whether it has gone in the direction that you expected for those of us who sort of operate outside of that space?
Well, you know, I think it's a good question. So we don't really, let me make sure I'm saying something that's true. The work of the Institute is a little bit downstream of algorithms. You know, like most of what we do is hire people who have thought about doing economic research and train them up to understand how to digest, you know, large amounts of data at scale so that they can do analysis that themselves aren't, let's call them innovative in computer science, right? Like, it's not that there's a new algorithm and it's, you know, it's going to be the way that the computer answers this question is generally speaking, you know, like a regression approach to the data that is already there. And it's sort of like not so much innovation in terms of the methodology. Like we do a little bit of algorithms by way of like some of the transformations we need to do of the data. Like they don't come to us in a way that has a structure that will be efficient. So I might nudge the team. It's like you could restructure that data, and here's how I think about doing an algorithm and do that. But they tend to be like relatively narrow in this role. In my prior role, we did more around algorithms. There we were trying to I'm trying to like stay clear of the IP question here. But we were trying to come up with generalized ways to characterize how people were thinking about things based on what they said about them. So we would look at sort of text and come up with algorithms and ways of characterizing, you know, extending on clustering algorithms and things like that to try to synthesize and bubble up the inferences about, you know, what do we think people think based on what they say, and what do we think they're going to do based on what we think they think. So there was more algorithmic work to be done than there is in the current role, which is like a different corner of the data science universe, so to speak.
Maxine, you're up next.
Hi, so this is kind of a follow-up to this question, which is how do you check for bias in your data? And if you're not doing much algorithm work right now, but how would you check for fairness in your algorithms, especially if you're making policy recommendations or giving your data to policymakers?
Yeah, that's another good question. Let me think about how to try to put, like usually when I think about the most commonly discussed intersection, at least that I see, between financial services, fairness, and algorithms is usually around like decision making, right? And it's more like individual decision making. Typically credit, I guess it could be other things. And so generally speaking, the shape of what we deliver isn't like, here is how you should make a decision. It's more like, here is what has happened that we see. I'm sure there is still scope for bias to creep in, either because of the way that the question was asked, because of the way you chose to kind of frame your analysis of the data, like what you decided to look at and what you thought was important. And we don't, I don't think I would say we certainly have like a formal process for doing that. Maybe this was that, but somebody asked earlier, like, how do we engage with stakeholders? Like, how do we sort of talk to policymakers? I would say that one of the things that we do that maybe helps us with this is before we release research, we typically, anyway, we try to speed up our process a little bit, so we do a little less than this than we used to. But we typically would do a lot of meetings with nonprofits, other researchers, other think tanks, to talk to them about what we're doing and what we're seeing. And sometimes that's where we get the feedback that helps us to restructure or reframe the question, or think a little bit more broadly about the impact of the implications that we might offer, or the recommendations that we might make. But that is honestly probably where other than trying to train people to think about it, trying to shine a light on it, but in terms of like a formal like process, it's probably mostly through the engagement. Again, partly because we aren't building decision systems where we're identifying the coefficient for the effect of X on Y, is most of what we're sort of delivering in most cases. So it's a good question. I want to think about some more.
I'm gonna jump in and let's see what other hands we get up. But I'm interested in hearing about how your sociological training, your sociological imagination comes to play in your work at the JPMorgan Chase Institute. I imagine this is a question you probably thought about, because it had to come to play in different ways when you're working at business schools. But how do those two things help you make creative decisions and do creative work where you are?
It's good. Everything's I'm an economist. People refer to me as an economist. I wish I still have my ASA card so that I could be like, oh, actually, I'm a card-carrying sociologist. Okay, so like when I'm gonna say, like, when I was a full-time practicing sociologist, I was like in the sociology of organizations and markets. So like it was a kind of an interesting, unusual kind of sociology to begin with. And then, as you pointed out, I was teaching in a business school for most of that time, which meant that I was mostly around economists. So it's a little bit of a circuitous answer to your question. All of which is to say that like that amount of exposure to economics without actually being trained per se in economics has led me to the place where I find economics to be an incredibly useful like first draft of an explanation for lots of things, right? It's like, well, okay, like let's imagine that markets work more or less perfectly in the ways that you might assume if you're an economist. Where would that take you in terms of your understanding of how whatever phenomenon you're looking at is working? But even in saying that, I guess I'm communicating a little bit of a gap between like what maybe a caricature of an economist and maybe what would be, which is to just assume that those things are true, and that as a complete explanation where I sort of take it as an interesting point of view on like, if you design a system assuming that people were going to act sort of more or less rationally, like what would happen? It's like, oh, that's interesting, but people don't, right? Like it's not my starting point. And so one of the things I think that the sociological training brings is the ability to be bicultural, like to have the space that you get from being bicultural to not sort of take for granted either the assumptions that you might have gotten from your own discipline, or the assumptions that you might get from sort of only having been in economics, as it were. That's probably like at a high level, I look at a problem and I'm like, well, maybe it's the community, or like, I don't know, like maybe it's something about the social structure that's around this. You know, maybe just tweaking incentives isn't going to get you all the way there, or even most of the way there. Like all of those, I think, probably come from having inhabited those two spaces for a while.
So I'm going to pass the mic to Yandu, who gets the last word with the last question.
Oh, this is a very daunting position, Annette, but thank you. So my question is, do you feel like your both academic training and also work as a professor in an academic environment prepared you for your current leadership and administrative position? And if not, what can we do? I'm a PhD student. What can we do to kind of prepare ourselves to potentially get to one of those types of positions?
No, maybe. Like in some ways, right? Like some of my job is, you know, looking at the research that our teams propose to do and sort of guiding that, right? And so like that piece, I think, you know, excellent training for that is spending all of your time working on your own research and then like reading everybody else's research, you know, 23 hours a day and all that, right? Like all of that is incredibly good training, but having the depth of a field and lots of experience with the process, I think, is really important. And, you know, if you're going to be working with junior researchers, being able to coach them, sort of see how they're developing and know where they're going, like that is incredibly helpful preparation for that part. Like I don't literally sell things, right? But like I sort of, so like sales, like I didn't get any sales experience doing that. Sometimes I say, not exactly kidding, we're all in sales, and sometimes it just takes us a long time to realize that. But like I do think that like that is maybe some very successful people in academia also have framed their work as like, I need to build a team that can deliver products and sort of get them to market in time. I need to understand like my audience and sort of like how they think about it. But I would say that's not super common. And so like everything that is on like the business and sales and managing even a small organization, you don't necessarily get unless you, well, maybe to make it a more constructive way in the way that you ask the question, you could probably organize your academic and research life in a way to facilitate that learning. Like I certainly remember junior colleagues, I remember being a little like, well, why would you do it that way? And I'm like, well, maybe that's where you're doing it. Who had a lab, but it didn't seem like they needed a lab, but they had a bunch of like undergrads that they worked with, and they sort of ran meetings. They had a production-oriented way of setting up the research. I suspect that builds more of the translatable skills that could be of use in the private sector. But yeah, it was a journey. I mean, it continued to be a journey communicating what the relevance is of sort of prior academic work to lots of sort of private sector things, and happy to have a longer conversation about that at some point if anybody's interested in like how does one make that transition, because it's, at least when I did, and maybe it's changed in the last 6, 7, 8 years, it was not that easy of a thing to explain.
So I'm going to ask a short follow-up question to close us out, which is, are there particular organizations that proved useful to you when you're making that transition or while you were in graduate school? I know a lot of PhD students in the business space credit the PhD project with creating opportunity. Are there other organizations in the academic space or that helped you transition out of the academic space that you might want to shout out and make us aware of?
Those organizations I think are really good for, were very, very helpful for, well, I mean, for two things, I guess. Like they're structured to support kind of the academic piece of it. They aren't really structured to support people in a transition. At least they, again, weren't 6, 7, 8 years ago. They do build up a network though. And so I would say it was much more networks than it was organizations that at least I found helpful. Like I found this job, you know, through a weak tie, as it were, right? Like a friend of a friend is now my co-president. A little bit long story short, right? And so like it wasn't somebody I knew particularly well, but got introduced, and like that's more or less how I ended up here. But yeah, I had a lot of conversations with people who I had networked with more so than the organizations kind of serving their mission, which tends to be to bring more people and retain more people in academia, which I think is a good thing to do. But as such, they're not so focused on like how I help somebody transition out of academia for the most part.
And is there a question you wished I asked you as we close out? Is there anything you want this gathering of brilliant Black people to know about you or your work or your path or opportunities at JPMorgan Chase Institute?
I am thrilled to see people, Black people, people in general, but especially Black people, sort of just be interested in exploring what's out there. No surprise anybody in this call. There's not a lot of us out there, and it would be helpful if there were more. So I think of just bringing more perspectives to these conversations, like that question about bias before. I think like part of the answer is like I'm me, like that's our control on bias. It's not really a good answer to that question, but in some sense, having many different voices and many different perspectives at the table is collectively, I think, a way to do something about that. And you don't get there unless you sort of do things like this. If you make like very intentional efforts to explicitly, reach out, start to build those networks, build connections, make it easier to make a cold call to somebody, like all of that, I think is really important. So it's not really a question as much as a thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're very busy, of lots of things on your plate, and that you made time and set aside time for us. It means a lot to me. As someone who's known you for a while, and then also I know Akira reached out to you also. So we are both, many thanks to you, and hopefully we have your address so we can send you some swag. We'll take a few minutes. So you've got about 3 minutes to head to your office hours rooms. We'll start to cycle Chris through those rooms beginning at 5 o'clock. Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.